So how do I do that? What's the magical solution to transform flash flooding liability into a groundwater asset? Does anyone have any ideas what we could do? Catchment, I'm hearing that one. Anyone else? Improve the soil, you got it, that's a big piece. Plant natives, that's right, we've got some deep roots. We can also shape the land into bowls, right? When you have a bowl under the sink, yeah, you can catch a lot of water in that bowl. Speaking of earthen bowls, who here has heard the story of Sela? Yeah, the Bamberger Ranch in Johnson City. 5,500 acres, completely dry when he bought it, no water. This is that place now. 30, 40 years later, he has lakes and springs. How did that happen? Any ideas? You got rid of some cedar? He planted native grasses is another big component that he says a lot. He'll hold up one of those bunch grasses and say, this is the greatest soil and water conservation tool ever invented because of the deep roots that it has. Do you have to own 5,500 acres to be part of solving our water problem? Does anyone in this room own 5,500 acres, by the way? If so, let's talk. No, even if you own a postage stamp quarter acre, you have the power to put water into the ground where you live. And so that's what rain gardening is all about. And I've left y'all on that screen for long enough. Our company was started in 2017. Our goal is to help sink water into the ground. I was inspired to start this business when I was working for tree folks along the Blanco River after the Memorial Day floods of 2015. And seeing the devastation of the flash flooding and then re-entering a drought right afterward really opened my eyes to, can we do something about this? Are we powerless? Or do we have the ability to become more resilient and help our land to heal? With fixing our water cycle, putting back native plants for our wildlife. Holding rainwater in our land became the biggest thing for me because driving by the Blanco River today broke my heart again. That river is dry in so many places. There's nothing left. It's not even a river anymore. It's a creek. It's seasonal, it's ephemeral. That's heartbreaking. And to look at that and just say, oh, nothing we can do about it, I don't find that acceptable. As a millennial, as someone with a career ahead of me, I'm gonna say, well, what can we do about that, right? Can we do something here? And yes, we can. We can sink water down. And at this point, I'm gonna remind y'all, those of you who've heard me speak before, of the number one thing that I want y'all to take away from this talk. What this is all about is slowing the water down, spreading the water out, sinking the water in. And I want y'all to say it with me so you remember. Slow the water down, spread the water out, sink the water in. One more time all together. Slow the water down, spread the water out, sink the water in. Okay, so we've got our motto, right? That's what we're going for. That's the number one thing to remember today. If you remember nothing else, if you zone out and fall asleep in the back row, that's fine. Just remember, slow the water down, spread the water out, sink the water in. You got it. We'll come back to that later. So what we do, for the most part, with my company is we build rain gardens. So the first question I get most of the time is, what's that? And what a rain garden is a form of xeriscaping. Y'all have heard of xeriscaping, right? Xeriscaping is great because it conserves water. But what if we can go beyond conservation? Conservation is rooted in, okay, let's just keep what we have. But our water situation in Texas, maybe we don't want to just stay here. Maybe we want to actively make it better. So a rain garden or a rainscape, rather than just conserving water, regenerates water. What do I mean by that? The water that's caught in a rainscape sinks back down into the aquifer and helps to sustain the flow in the rivers even during a drought. That's that slowing it down and sinking it into the aquifer, and then we have it months from now. It's not just all rushing to the river and going away all at once. So with that, first, what we do, there's some components here. I talked about digging a bowl in the ground, AKA a basin. So the basin is where we scoop out the soil and make a space for the water to sit. It needs to slow down in there. It spreads across the basin, and then it sinks down into the earth from there. Without a structure like this, oftentimes the water just slides across the surface of the land, especially when we're getting a really intense rain event. This is also a great place to plant some plants that like a little extra water. We get to add more diversity when we have a little bowl in the ground. The plants that like more wet feet like to live in the bottom of these basins. You're creating a microclimate, essentially, where you can have those water-loving plants. Now, I'm not talking like pond-level water-loving, but plants that like a little bit more moisture. So there's a great picture of a basin. It's outlined by rocks. This rocky area in here will fill up with water during a rain event, and then that water sinks into the soil. I'm going to address one of my most frequently asked questions right now, but doesn't that breed mosquitoes? Great question. The water sinks into the ground so fast that mosquitoes can't breed there. Within 48 hours, that water is gone. And at my house, where we have, let's see, we've got 5 rain gardens now. I have to run outside while it's raining to see the water in the basins because it sinks into the soil so quickly. While it's actively raining, the water is there, and within an hour, we live on top of a limestone hill. Within an hour, that water is down in that limestone hill. That one's about 6 inches. We generally go 6 inches to a foot, depending on how large the garden is. Sometimes we'll go a little bit deeper if we have more room. Great question. It depends on where we are in the hill country. And, oh, sorry, thank you, Holly. The question I had was, how deep is that? Which is about 6 to 12 inches. Sometimes we'll go as deep as 2.5 feet. And then the other question is, how deep is bedrock? Sometimes 2 inches down, and then we only go 2 inches down. Sometimes where you find that people think they're on bedrock, and we start scraping at it with our excavator, and we're like, no, you just have a bunch of car-sized boulders. We'll pick those up and move them a little bit. So the next component of a rain garden is a berm. So when we scoop the soil out to form the basin, that soil has to go somewhere. And it would be plain ridiculous to haul that off to a landfill. So what we do is we flip that soil over and use it to create a berm on the downhill side. So scoop and flip, and we've got a mounded up area on the downhill side. That helps to keep the water stuck in that basin. Usually that is the best place for our more dry-loving species. So we've got a place in the basin for the plants that love water. We've got a place on the berm for plants that don't like a lot of water. If I put a prickly pear down in the basin, it will drown, I guarantee you. And if I put a plant for the basin, let's say a white-top sedge on top of the berm, then it will dry out. So one of my favorite things about rain gardens, as someone who loves native plants, is that it opens up so much more opportunity for diversity. This is a big installation out in Bernie. The next component is what's referred to as a dry creek. A dry creek is a conveyance structure. It helps us move water from one basin to the next basin. We always want to plan where our overflow points are, because we're going to try and catch 2 inches of rain, that's our goal. But when we get 10 inches of rain within 2 days, the extra water has to have somewhere to go. So we very carefully plan where our outflows are. So the dry creek is this feature here between 2 basins. It's carrying the water from the upper one to the lower one. Oftentimes, these are places where we're going to put a lot of river rock so that the elevation is, even if there's a, let's say we've had at least 3 feet of drop from one side to the other, trying to move water to the other basin. Well, we don't want to have a huge trench in the ground, so we backfill that with river rock, and that makes it so that the water moves smoothly through that trench, it doesn't erode, and it's not a tripping hazard. Okay, so now we've got our 3 main components of a rain garden: your basin to hold the water, your berm to be the raised portion behind that on the downhill side, and your dry creek to move the water from one place to another, from the gutter to the rain garden, and then from the rain garden out to the overflow. I want to mention right away that if you are kind of baffled by this concept of rain gardens, and you're like, what is that? I'm really interested, but it's not making sense just seeing it in pictures. We do host a rain garden open house and native plant sale on the first Saturday of every month in San Marcos. Throughout the year, we carry about 250 different species of native plants. Always the first Saturday. Those have gotten so popular that we've had to slow down and spread out our customers. And so we are now offering through the summer mid-month plant sales by appointment only on Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays. So if you're interested in those, please take a look at our website, eranativeland.com. That will give you the information you need to be able to sign up for an appointment time and find us in San Marcos on top of our hill and see the rain gardens that we have there. Now, diving into the plants, because this is a group of people that loves plants, right? Am I in the right room? All right, cool. So if you have a berm, that's the dry spot, and it's really sunny, my top 5 plants are going to be these. Blanket flower. This is a gorgeous annual, it reseeds readily. I like to call this a buy one, get 20 free next year plant. Sometimes they're up to about 2 feet tall. They'll handle a full sun, and they're moderately deer resistant, great for attracting butterflies, and like all the berm plants, they really like good drainage. And by the way, these are not the only plants that you could use in a berm. None of these plants are the only ones. Like I said, we carry 250 different species. Many of our installations have 75 plus plants species in them. So there's a lot more diversity than this. I'm just hitting my highlight plants. So snake herb, this is a really gorgeous one. No, it doesn't attract snakes. It's just called that because of its growth habit. It blooms from April to October. It really, really likes full sun. If you've got a rocky, full sun area without deer, this is a great plant for you. Great for little rock gardens, though, if you've got an area that's fenced off. By the way, just an aside, if you have a deer problem, and I keep giving away this secret, and you have a plant that you want to grow that's really, really deer sensitive, go buy antique bird cages. Put the antique bird cage over the deer sensitive plant, and then the deer can't get to it. You might need to staple it down if the deer are particularly hungry. But since I've started saying that, I see less and less antique bird cages, so maybe I should stop giving away my secrets, but there y'all go, freebie. Another great one, and this is one that if you do have a lot of deer, I used to live on a game ranch out by the Frio. They had way too many deer. but they did have mealy blue sage growing in their pastures. Absolutely gorgeous plant, super long blooming. Hummingbirds go crazy for it. And it will often have a bloom in the early summer, like now, and then a bloom later in the summer. Next, this one is a little less well known. The mealy blue sage is very, very popular. This next plant is velvet leaf senna. This one I got introduced to because it volunteered in our yard, and I was like, aren't you gorgeous? Who are you? And it gets pretty tall, about as tall as I am, with big yellow blooms, clusters. Absolutely gorgeous, and even when it's done blooming, the silvery leaves look phenomenal. In fact, I'm happy about it before it blooms. While it's blooming, I'm ecstatic, and then after it blooms, I'm like, you're still so gorgeous, and I can't wait for those seeds to be ready to spread them everywhere. This one handles really dry, rocky soils. Another one that's highly deer resistant. They don't like the texture of those silky leaves. It is a perennial, comes back year after year. It does sometimes volunteer readily if it likes the situation. So another buy one, get 20 free next year plant. Super low water use on this. The velvet on the leaves is an adaptation to reduce the amount of moisture it loses through the leaves. This is also a member of the legume family, and like most legumes, it's going to fix nitrogen in the soil around it. So it's actually the other life forms in the soil around the root nodes that do that magic of converting atmospheric nitrogen to plant available nitrogen. But it's super cool to be able to use a plant to help fertilize the other plants around it, and this one does that. All right, the last one of our top 5 sunny berm plants is the fall aster. Super popular. Unlike most of the plants I've highlighted here that are spring and summer blooms, this is our fall bloom. And when you're designing a garden, you want to make sure that you have as many months of blooming as you can so that there's always food in the grocery store for your pollinators. This fall aster is wonderful because when the monarchs are migrating through, it's blooming its head off, making basically a low purple shrub. It's purple because it's covered in purple blooms. And that's a great source of food for the monarch butterflies as they come through. Moving on, we've got our shady berm plants. So we've built a berm and there's a shade tree. Well, what plants in Texas handle shade, right? A lot of people say, oh no, it's so sunny in Texas, there aren't any shade plants in Texas. Yes, there are. Of course there are. We have beautiful forests of live oaks, and we've got junipers, so we've got shady plants that'll handle those conditions. One of my favorites, and this one is less commonly available in the nursery trade, but definitely should be out there more, and we're working on that right now too, is propagating these and getting them out there. Heartleaf skullcap, super gorgeous, velvety leaves, beautiful purple blooms in the springtime, full to part shade. In fact, I've noticed mine, some of these are a little flexible. Mine is reaching from a shady area. It's doing stunningly there, and it's also reaching under the fence to come up in the sunny area too. So they're a little bit flexible. Then we've also got that it attracts hummingbirds and butterflies. Another one that's highly deer resistant, those velvety leaves that are great for helping the plant retain moisture, also make it taste kind of icky to deer. This one does have some medicinal uses that you can look up if you're interested, and that is another reason that it's deer resistant, because it has those compounds in it that have medicinal properties. This is another one that's perennial as well. Most of the plants that I use in our installations are perennials. We occasionally use annuals for filling space very quickly, but for the most part, we're going for perennial plants. Chili piquin. Who has had salsa with chili piquin in it? All right, awesome. So we've got some people that not only use plants, native plants for wildlife, but also use them yourselves. My husband is not allowed to put these in pickle jars anymore because he always forgets to mark which pickles are the spicy pickles, and then I get really mad. These are very, very spicy. To me, they're for the birds, but for people who like spicy food, go for it. 1 or 2 in a pickle jar is definitely plenty. The birds love to eat these fruits as well. Birds don't have the same taste receptors for spicy things, so they're not spicy to the birds. They love to eat them. Once you have one, the birds are going to help you spread those. So this is great if you want to, have a plant and then create what I like to call a nucleus of restoration, and then the wildlife helps you spread those plants throughout the land. This is a great plant because it is very low water use. I have seen them go dormant during the drought last summer, and I'm like, did I lose it? And it popped right back up this year. I think that's an important thing to note, is oftentimes we see a plant die on the top and think, oh, it's completely gone. Please, please don't rip it up from the roots. Let it have the opportunity to come back. Often when the rain returns, these plants return. They're adapted for drought, and the best thing they can do when it gets really hot and really dry is go in the air conditioning underground, just like we want to go in the air conditioning when it's this hot. This one's great because it is flexible. I've seen it handle sun and shade, and it also is soil type flexible. Horse herb. This is one of my favorites for replacing St. Augustine lawns because it is a nice carpet of turf. You can mow it. It makes great barefoot space, and it has cute little yellow blooms. It's also called straggler's daisy sometimes. This is pretty deer resistant. They will eat it if they're hungry enough, but then again, I've seen deer eat datura when they were hungry enough, so, that deer probably had a bad day eating the datura, but generally speaking, this one is pretty deer resistant. It's another one that in the heat of the summer in August, it might go dormant, but it does come back when it gets the moisture that it needs and a little bit cooler temperatures. This is an easy one to propagate by cuttings and root division. Finding seeds available is not really an option because the seeds are so teeny tiny, it's just not viable for growers. If you don't mow it, it can get 12 inches tall and a little leggy, but one of the things that you can do if you're using it as a turf is just mow it like you normally would in that space. Pigeonberry is another one that I've come to enjoy. This used to be known as rogue plant because the red berries that it produces, women would use as like a blush. I'm not sure how safe that is based on what compounds are in the berries, but little fun fact. The pink blooms are really cute and delicate, and then it produces those red berries. So you get the interest of the flowers and the interest of the berries as well. Definitely don't eat those berries, but the birds absolutely love those, and oftentimes you will find them popping up where birds have been. I say this is moderately deer resistant. I've seen it growing in places where their deer definitely visit, but it's not one of those, highly deer resistant plants. It's really important to think about deer resistance as a spectrum where you have really sensitive plants and then really, really highly deer resistant plants. Purple leather flower. This is a really wonderful plant. I have it growing over my front door. It's a vine that's not super aggressive, so great for putting on a porch. These bell-shaped blooms are absolutely gorgeous. They look like little fairy hats to me. It does like a little bit of extra water. Typically when I see it growing, I see it growing along riverbeds and climbing up the trees in riverbed areas. Super gorgeous. They get quite large. It does go dormant in the wintertime. So the vine goes away and then comes back next spring. The coolest thing about this is hummingbirds fly up underneath that bellflower and are, hovering with their head straight up to drink from it. It's super cool to watch. And that's one of the reasons I recommend putting it by porches. Not only is it a vine that won't eat your house, but it is a vine that getting to watch the hummingbirds fly to and drink out of is just a really, really cool experience. To the root. Yes. Yeah, thanks. I'll repeat that question. Does it die back completely, or does it, like to the root, or does it die and, right. So it goes all the way back to the root because the vine itself is herbaceous rather than woody. All right, next we have plants for our sunny basins. So these are places where we've got a little extra moisture because we have dug the space out, and it's also in the bright sun. So this is not quite a constructed wetland because it doesn't stay moist that long, especially during droughts, but you are able to get some more diversity in those spaces. One of my favorite examples that's happening right now at my house, I did an experiment where I put a Texas spider lily in the bottom of a basin on top of the limestone hill. Last year, drought happened. I watered once a month through the summer in that area. I have not watered even once in that area this year, and the Texas spider lily is coming up. Now that is a wetland plant, like truly loves water. So the fact that it is able to survive in the bottom of that basin, even with our weather conditions, has been really, really exciting. And that's part of the power of having these basins, is you create a pocket of what's referred to as subsoil moisture or subsurface moisture. It's also referred to sometimes as a swale plume. Another term for basin is swale. And so you've got this water flowing underground there, and it's moving very slowly through the soil, so the plants have access to it. And that's why you're able to get away with much more diversity of water-loving plants than you would if you just planted them in flat ground. Texas bluebells. Who's ready for ice cream? So this is one of those plants that has become very rare because it's too pretty and everyone likes it as cut flowers. Often it's listed as an annual. I'm gonna call that one and say maybe sometimes, but not always, because the one in my yard is the same plant and it's lasted 3 years. So I don't know how true that is. Sometimes there are things written about plants and we have to check them with our observations. It likes moisture locations and sandy loam soil, and it will handle the blazing full sun. We have this out in the rain garden in the center of our driveway, and it has performed phenomenally well, and is one of those that I watch for every year. The blooms are just about to open now. So if anyone wants to come to our plant sale this coming Saturday on June 1st, you might get to see the bluebell's first blooms. I've got my fingers crossed hoping that it's gonna happen this weekend. Next, we have the blue flag iris. This is our native iris. They're native from Virginia all the way down to East Texas, and then there's some isolated populations that extend even farther east, San Marcos area. I don't know if their natural range actually comes out this far, but if you want an iris for Texas that is going to hold up better than traditional irises without irrigation, this is a great one to use so that you're getting your native plant and you're also getting that traditional garden look. Often when I'm designing for someone in an HOA who wants it to look a certain way, a little more formal, this is a go-to plant because we're using a native plant and fitting in with plants that people recognize, like an iris. Next is the swamp milkweed. This is a really great one that we're able to grow thanks to having a rain garden basin. You might only see them along creeks and riverbeds if you don't have that kind of feature, but we're excited because we get to grow swamp milkweed in various places. That gives an extra layer of milkweed diversity. We also have a bunch of aquatic milkweed at our nursery right now, which I have been shocked to see performing very well even in conditions that I think are pretty dry and don't fit the term aquatic. Let's see, but swamp milkweed itself, another great host plant for the monarch butterflies for a little more wet conditions than, say, our antelope horns or green milkweed or butterfly weed. If you are lucky enough to have a creek or river area or a stock tank, any place where there's a bunch of water, you might consider adding the swamp milkweed or the aquatic milkweed so that you have that for the monarch and queen butterflies. Yeah, so all milkweeds are toxic, and that's why the monarch caterpillars feed on them. Oh, I'll repeat the question. He asked, what do I mean when I list it as toxic? So part of the reason milkweeds are in such decline is because a lot of people who had livestock didn't want those in the pasture with their livestock because they are toxic to livestock if the livestock eat them. Generally, livestock avoid toxic plants, but like deer, if they're hungry enough, they'll eat anything. So the toxicity in milkweed helps the monarch butterfly caterpillars and the monarch butterflies themselves to taste bad so they're not eaten as much by birds. And so that's what I mean by toxic. It has that milky sap that is vomit-inducing for birds. But that also happens to make it highly deer-resistant. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I'll repeat that so everyone can hear. That milky sap can also, if you get it on your hands and rub it in your eyes, create irritation. Lots of plants that are super deer-resistant. Lantana causes contact dermatitis. So when you're planting a deer-resistant garden, you're also, dealing with, okay, these plants might be a little more difficult to work with. Either they're thorny or they're, have some sort of irritant. Next, we have elderberry. This is one that has a lot of medicinal uses, a lot of great uses for bird food, and absolutely wonderful for growing along our riverbanks. It's a colony-forming tree. So it is a fast, aggressive grower. I saw recently a thing on Facebook that was like, when I see a native plant that's labeled as aggressive, I just say good for her. I like to refer to them as bossy. They spread and fill space. But there are moments where I want a bossy native plant that's gonna take up all of that space. If I've got a lot of area to fill, yes, I want Maximilian sunflower. Yeah, I want something like elderberry or fall obedient plant, because oftentimes if I'm fighting something like Bermuda grass that's a really aggressive invasive, the best thing I can do to fight the Bermuda grass is have an equally aggressive native plant do my fighting for me, because to be honest, I am not gonna get out there every day and hand pull Bermuda grass. I just wanna shade that out. So elderberry is a great buddy for that if you have the space for it. It can get quite tall. It is a small tree. And yes, if you don't process the berries, stems, leaves, roots, and unripened fruit correctly, they can be toxic. So if you are using elderberry for medicinal purposes, you do need to be careful and always look that up. It is great for erosion control because it forms those dense colonies. Another moment where you want to have aggressive native plants is when you are trying to stabilize soil because you're worried about erosion. And then the last one on this sunny basin list is the swamp sunflower. That's up to 5 feet tall, a little more rare in this region than, say, your Maximilian sunflower. I like to use this when I need to be a little more formal looking and have that classic sunflower shape without it being a big, crazy looking plant. Moderately deer resistant and variable on soil type. It's not super particular about that. I mentioned the Maximilian sunflower. Who in here is familiar with that one? Okay, great. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, great big sunflowers with multiple blooms up the stalks. They are phenomenal. I planted one that was, well, 2 that were 4 inches big last May, And by October at the eclipse, they were about 8 feet tall, covered with yellow blooms up and down, super widespread, absolutely gorgeous. And I was using them in an area where I was crowding out Bermuda grass, and they did a great job with that. And now this year, they are still filling that space, and I am making more and taking them to other places. Truly a buy one and probably get more like 200 free the next year type plan. Yeah.
Shannon, we were told to plant the Maximilian sunflower on the south side of the building. Is that true? Should we move them other places?
Yeah. I'll repeat that so everyone can hear. You were told to plant it on the Maximilian sunflower on the south side of a building. They can live in plenty of other locations other than that. I have them on the west side of my house. I have them on the east side of my house. They're doing fine in both places. The idea of planting them on the south side is probably more about creating shade. You can use them to create a bit of shade without having a tree there, which is sometimes really, really useful. Yeah, I could see the wind blowing them over, but generally in the winter season, they're going dormant to their roots anyway and will come back just fine from the roots. And for those of you who love your native plants and have seen how Maximilian looks really gorgeous in the wintertime and then starts to look kind of, or looks really gorgeous in the fall, and then in the wintertime it starts to look kind of like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree, we'll say. If you can, leave those stalks up. I know it's hard if you're in a residential area and want it to look pretty. I was itching to chop mine back all winter, but just held on till the end of February because waiting to chop it back protected the roots from the wind and also created not only space for birds to eat the seeds, but also created those hollow stems or places for pollinators as well. So if you have the ability to leave it tall, and just say, well, it's going to look gorgeous later. Yeah. Yeah, so I've seen Maximilian sunflower handle the basins. It does really well and gets huge. In situations that are more dry, I have seen it handle that just fine, but not get super tall. It ends up being like hip height. It's rather flexible, but at the same time, getting it established, of course, always making sure that it has enough water to get started. But they'll thrive more with extra moisture. Oh, I forgot to repeat that question. It was, do the Maximilians need a lot of water to grow? And the answer is basically they'll vary in height depending on moisture availability. Yeah.
We found that white water never would overachieve. And so we also found that at mid-season, if you chop them back, you would middle 2 feet off them, they come right back to a natural height, not a rate.
Yes, that's a great point. I'll repeat that. Cutting them back in mid-season is a great idea. It makes it so they're not quite so overachieving is the word you used. We'll use that word. Yeah. It can make it so that it's a, not a 10-foot tall tower that's falling over, but is a more manageable size. Cutting back right about mid-June, I find is really good. Oh, really? Awesome. Yeah, and also great for the birds. Yeah. Next, we have our shady basin plants. So sometimes you've got a lot of shade and a rain garden basin. This is one of the more difficult conditions to find because of, or these are some of the more rare plants to find because there aren't a lot of shaded, moist areas in a lot of Texas. Much of the prairie had very sunny and low-lying wet areas at the same time. For a shady, low-lying wet area, we find golden groundsel to be a really great one. It gets about 3 feet tall. Another one that buy one, get 20 free the next year. This one can handle sun and part shade. It does prefer the more high moisture areas and rich acidic soil. Apparently, while it's mildly toxic, it did have some medicinal use by Native Americans. A lot of that information has been lost, but there are some good references. Looking at Meriwether's Foraging Texas is always a good go-to for anyone interested in medicinal plants and how to prepare them. It's a great early spring bloomer, so in February when things are just breaking, the pollinators are just coming out of winter dormancy, this is a great food source for them. Next, we have big red sage. This is one I love to use in our installations because it was believed to have gone extinct. They found a remnant population and it has been brought back from the brink. Gets pretty tall, up to 4 feet. Absolutely stunning red blooms. The hummingbirds go crazy for it. This is one that if you have deer, you're going to want to put a bird cage on it. Part of the reason that it was believed to be extinct was because overgrazing, overblown deer populations, all did a number on those populations, and so where it was found was in a little canyon where it was protected from grazing and from a bunch of deer. And this one does handle the extra moisture and gets quite a bit taller when it has the extra moisture. One of the most interesting things, as an aside, that we find with our projects is we start out by analyzing the watershed and looking at the way the water flows through the land, and oftentimes our maps, when they show the little rivers that flow through the land, that's where we find really big plants, which makes a lot of sense. That's where the big tree is where there's a drainage that's moving through there. And so plants like this, when they get that extra water, they get much bigger. Turns out the limiting factor to growth in Central Texas for plants is the availability of moisture. I wish that we could use that as, a metric for how much we can grow the human population here, but I guess we're going to figure that out with piping water from one place to another. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. The question is, what is facultative wetland? So there is a thing referred to as wetland indicator status. And that is something that is put together by the USDA. They go through and they say, well, this plant indicates that there's water here. This plant must have water all the time. So there's various levels of that. So you have your obligate wetland plants. They absolutely must always, always, always have water, or they will die. Your big cypress trees must always have water, or they will die. So they're an obligate wetland plant. And then you have your facultative wetland plant that, it wants a pretty good amount of moisture. It's not going to necessarily die if it gets a little dry. So kind of, sometimes wet, sometimes dry is okay. And then you have your upland species. Facultative upland species means that it prefers mostly dry conditions but can handle some extra moisture. Like a juniper tree is like that. It'll handle some extra moisture but mostly grows in the uplands. And then you have your true upland species where if they get their feet too wet, they will drown. So, for example, a prickly pear would be listed as just upland. So that's the breakdown of facultative wetland, obligate wetland, facultative upland, and then upland. I think the people with the dowsing rods that are like, oh, there's water over here, I think part of that is they can read the land for where the water is based on what the plants are revealing about the soil. If you see a willow tree, there's water there. That's what the plant says in a very, very literal scientific sense. It wouldn't grow there if there wasn't water. It is telling you that, yes, there's water here. So, Yeah. It's pretty fascinating how certain plants are attracted to where the water is, and you can use them to to know that even if the water isn't there now, it will be there later. Two-flower millet grass. This has become a favorite of mine. How many of y'all have heard of inland sea oats? All right. Do you ever get bored of inland sea oats? No? Okay. Well, I've gotten a little bored of using inland sea oats for shady areas. I love that plant, but also, huh? I'm saying I get a little bored with just inland sea oats. I want a little more diversity in my shaded grasslands. I like a little more diversity mixed in. I'm sorry, I'm not hating on inland sea oats. I do love it. I do love inland sea oats. But the two-flower millet grass also works with inland sea oats, and you can create a tiered effect. You can have the low-growing two-flower millet and then the taller inland sea oats behind it. Absolutely lovely little dangling seeds, almost like Cytosphroma in the way that they dangle. This one is usually found in like stream banks and wetland areas, just like the inland sea oats, but it's a great one to add that extra diversity in a shady area where you want that meadow effect. And if you want a grass for the shade, this is another great one. It is perennial, comes back year after year. Dwarf palmetto, absolutely wonderful. We use this one all the time because it is a great evergreen source of interest. That's one of the more difficult things in Central Texas. Whose garden looks like not super presentable in February? Anyone else have that experience? Yeah, I'm seeing some nodding. That's a difficult month to get things to look pretty. I like my dwarf palmettos as a big old anchor for when everything else looks kind of meh. The dwarf palmetto is still going to be stunning. So it's nice to have those big evergreen plants in that space. This one can handle sun, part shade. It likes extra moisture, but doesn't necessarily have to have it. I've got one that is surviving in the upper part of a basin that's doing just fine without irrigation. They grow slow, though, very, very slow. If you've ever wondered why a big 5-gallon dwarf palmetto costs so much, it's because it takes about 5 years to get that big. So this is for the long haul. It's like investing in a tree. It's going to be a baby for a while, and then when it grows up, it will be worth the wait. And the fruits of those are also edible. This is a lesser-known plant for this area, very, very rare. I've only seen it in the wild one time, but I do like to highlight it because it is just a showstopper. I found this along the shores of the Blanco River between Wimberley and Kyle in an area known as Little Arkansas, growing in the shade of the cypress trees right along the riverbank. Gorgeous red blooms. You do have to have the right conditions for it in Texas. It needs that shade, it needs that water. Farther to the northeast, I've seen it growing in sunny areas, but down here it really, really needs that shade. So because we're on the western edge of its range and the southern edge of its range. Super gorgeous plant though, another one that has that, toxic but medicinal thing going on. Which is super fascinating. Great for attracting hummingbirds, obviously, with the red blooms. If you can't quite find the space for a cardinal flower, but really like the look, we more frequently use the scarlet sage in the same spaces. And not that scarlet sage is on here, but one thing I will say about scarlet sage is it is a fussy little plant in terms of it'll grow everywhere. It comes up just fine, but when it starts to get dry and hot, it's going to tell you. It's going to be like, I'm dying of thirst, please water, please water. So I like to use it as an indicator species. If we don't have irrigation and are relying on hand watering, I love to plant a little scarlet sage somewhere in that garden because it will tell me, absolutely for sure, yes, please water now. It's going to wilt, and then it'll come right back faster than anybody else. And so that's actually extremely useful to have an indicator species of when to water. Not cardinal flower, scarlet sage. Yeah. Oh, yes, the cardinal flower is pretty deer resistant because it is toxic. Generally speaking, If you want deer resistant, you're going for spiky or toxic. If you want to make my head ache as a landscape designer, you're going to say, I have a shady area with deer and kids, so you can't use anything spiky or toxic. And then I'm just going to be like, oh, huh? Oh, and chickens, yes, oh, great. Yeah, super difficult to design for. There are some plants that'll work, mostly native bunch grasses, but that's a tricky scenario to design for. Next, we have our more flexible plants. So the plants I've highlighted up until now are pretty much exclusively, need to be on a berm or need to be in the basin. And like we talked about a minute ago with facultative wetland or obligate wetland, these flexible moisture plants are going to be your more facultative wetland to facultative upland species. So rattlesnake master, this is a super cool one that usually grows a little farther east than here. I think they're stunning. One of my favorites of the Gulf Coast prairie. This is rattlesnake master. It is a carrot family member. It looks like a yucca almost in terms of its leaf structure. And it is super cool because it is a yucca that I can put in the bottom of a rain garden. A yucca for water? Cool. So I use that oftentimes in the bottom of basins. It is another great winter interest plant because of those yucca-like leaves. It does self-seed pretty readily. I'm not going to say that it's necessarily a buy one, get 20 free the next year. It's more like a buy one, get 5 free the next year, or at least that's been my experience so far, but maybe the seeds just haven't come up as much as would normally be expected, but they are in one of our rain gardens and I'm not seeing them spread the way I hoped. So maybe there's that. They can get up to 6 feet tall when they have enough moisture. Mine are only about 4 feet tall, probably because I don't get as much water here as farther east. Whoopsie. Hold on, I just went back a little bit. 1 second. If you get vertigo or motion sickness, don't look at the screen until I say look. Okay, purple coneflower. So this is one of the most popular native plants, worth highlighting because it's popular because it works everywhere. If you're just starting out with native plants, yes, plant some purple coneflower. It's going to be stunning. It's going to work well for you. It's going to reseed. You're going to get more. You're going to get those butterflies and even hummingbirds to your yard. And it handles those sunny conditions, handles variable moisture levels. Really, truly a great plant. It's popular for a reason. We also have some local endemic species that are just native to local areas, like the narrowleaf coneflower is a really cool local endemic for out in this area that's a little more drought-hardy. Deer resistance on that one is more of a moderate. I have seen deer eat it. It's not their favorite thing, but like I said, they're hungry enough, they're going to eat datura, which is, for those who don't know about datura, it's a highly, highly toxic plant.
So we're having trouble with bunny rabbits eating our purple coneflower.
Yes.
So we have to get little cages around them. But if something's deer resistant, it's not necessarily bunny resistant.
Yes, that is correct. Different palettes on those. Yeah, for sure.
I was told one time that when you have a deer-resistant plant, doesn't mean that deer won't get it. Because it depends on how many deer you have in your herd that goes through it. Everybody takes bites. And if you have no yellow doesn't hunt, it's gone.
Yeah, they often will sample things, especially new things. When you plant a new garden, that's a deer salad bar, and they're like, let's try everything. And even something that tastes nasty to them, they'll grab it, spit it out, and it's pulled out of the ground, and you have to really watch on replanting it. Making exclosures for gardens is a great way to go for when you're in an area with a lot of deer. A trick from living on the game ranch is if space is less than 4 feet wide, a deer will not jump into it. So what I've done oftentimes and it's not the prettiest thing, but if you keep your beds to under 4 feet in width and use that utility panel or hog panel, you can get 16, 20-foot long runs of that, and then you put 16, 20 feet that way, and then 4 feet here, 4 feet there. You can create a box that the deer won't go in. This is usually better in situations where you're not going for a more manicured look, but it can allow you to introduce diversity to a space that wouldn't otherwise be there, and then the birds can spread that diversity to the places where it can work. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time here. We're at 8:01, so I'm going to move a little more quickly through these because I want to respect y'all's time this evening. Yarrow, this is a great medicinal plant for helping to stop bleeding. Also has beautiful white blooms for pollinators. And then one of the best things about it for just the appearance in the garden, it has those really fern-like leaves that can be super pretty. Oftentimes I see people saying, oh, that's more of a, needs a little shade plant type of plant. I have it growing on the west side of our house. It gets blazing western sun in the afternoon and is doing just fine. Again, a flexible moisture plant, we'll put it on a berm or we'll put it in a basin just depending on where we feel like it fits. And it can be used as a cut flower as well. Another one that we use in both scenarios is wine cup. This one can handle the lower wet areas and the upper drier areas, just depending. We've had the annual wine cup spread throughout a rain garden at our house. It was originally on the berm. It's migrated into the basin and covering the berm, so it's a flexible plant. This one here, the Invoprata, is the perennial wine cup that's more low growing as a ground cover rather than the more upright annual wine cup. Apparently the tuber is edible. I've never had the heart to dig one up and try it because they're just too pretty for that. And if I want a potato, I'm going to just eat a potato. But a super lovely plant. We like to mix this with pink evening primrose because you get that dark pink and the light pink at the same time. This one is one that deer will eat, the wine cups. And I mentioned pink evening primrose. This is my favorite native plant to eat. I graze on this all day long. The pink petals taste like butter lettuce and have that silky texture to them. So if you want to, get wild with a burger for 4th of July, put some of those pink blooms on top of it. This is, if you've been driving along the highway and you see just an expanse of just nothing but like that light pink, this is the one. They spread very aggressively. Yes, buy one, get 200 free next year. It works in a lawn. So if you're looking to have a lawn that is also a wildflower meadow, this is a great plant for that because you can mow it and it doesn't mind at all. It will just keep popping up. And the pink blooms are just absolutely stunning. All right, we're at the last section. This is plants that are flexible moisture and will handle shade. My first #1 favorite, this is a plant that I've known since I was 8 years old and was being taught about native plants at my elementary school in Houston. Fall obedient plant, or as my team jokes, that's the disobedient plant. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this species, it does spread very aggressively. Good for her, right? Good for her. She's going to spread and fill that space, super bossy. If you've got an area where you're struggling with Bermuda grass, it's very flexible on moisture and very flexible on sunlight. Mine have one set growing in the back of the house in the shade and one set growing on that western side of the house in the sun. So it'll handle that. I will say that if it is in the sun, it wants a little more water than if it's in the shade. This one reproduces readily by rhizomes. So what that means is to propagate it, you take the roots from the ground and you take them and put them somewhere else, and then you've got another new plant. And you can do that as many times as you want and get it established all over the place. Pairs wonderfully with Maximilian sunflower, by the way. So you've got these pinkish purple blooms at about this high, and then Maximilian sunflower towering above it. Absolutely stunning together. Inland sea oats. I promised I wasn't just hating on inland sea oats. I was going to get to it. I absolutely love inland sea oats, aka fish on a pole grass. They look like little fish dangling off of a pole. Likes to grow in those low-lying wet areas along rivers oftentimes, but I have also seen them on hilltops underneath live oaks where they have shade. In the sun, they need more water. In the shade, they can get away with less water. Like many of the native grasses, these are shelter plants. The number of times that I've seen pollinator gardens that exclude grasses kind of scares me. Because if you build a pollinator garden and you have lots of blooms, that's great and beautiful. That's wonderful. But you built a grocery store or a restaurant, not a home, right? So I encourage people to, every time they're building a pollinator garden, include at least one and hopefully more of our native bunch grasses. Because this area was prairie, our native bunch grasses are a foundation of this ecosystem, and when it gets cold outside, that's where all of your critters are going to go to shelter from that cold. The sad story of how I learned that the hard way, we were hired to come out and do some maintenance, and we're trimming up the native bunch grasses. It was a cold, windy, wet day in February. And we start trimming back those native grasses, circling them with weed whackers. Within 2 minutes, butterfly bits all over the ground. I said, full stop, we cannot do this today. Whoops, big mistake. So that's a, teachable moment. If you're gonna maintain your native grasses, do it on a warm, windless day in early March, not late February. And also, it was a real eye-opener for me of how powerful our grasses are as shelter. They're really, really critical. All creatures need shelter, not just food. So always make sure to include your bunch grasses. Inland sea oats is a great one that works for shade and sun. Also, not just pollinators will use it. Your birds and small mammals are going to use the seeds and also the leaves for nesting material. And like most grasses, inland sea oats is highly deer resistant. So when I get that question about, I don't want something spiky, I don't want something toxic, but I need something deer resistant, native bunch grasses all the way. That's going to be your number one pick because surprisingly, deer are not really grazing animals, they're browsing animals. So it means they like broadleaf stuff rather than grasses. Now if you were dealing with cattle and goats, then, well, different story. Like we talked about with the bunnies. Deer resistant doesn't necessarily mean bunny resistant. Deer resistant doesn't necessarily mean cattle resistant. Another one that, how many times have I said this plant's my favorite? I have too many favorite plants. Turk's cap is another one that I've known since I was a little kid. Wonderful plant, great for the hummingbirds. And then, in terms of edible native plants, this is a number one because it produces something edible in 3 seasons. A lot of people know, yeah, you can eat the flowers, yeah, you can eat the fruits, but even in the early springtime, those fresh green leaves that are still soft and tender, those are also edible. So how often is it that there is a plant that you can eat from, March all the way through November? Pretty rare find, and it's perennial, and it's native. That's a winner on my book. Handles sun, handles shade. Again, if it's in the sun, more water, in the shade, less water. But super great, very, very flexible plant. In terms of deer resistance, it is a moderate, because if we can eat the leaves and snack on them, yeah, you bet the deer will. But great plant to have, and that little fruit, the manzanita, or little apple in Spanish, is super tasty both for people and for birds. Almost to the end here, we've got white mist flower. That is a great one for your fall blooms. Really important, again, to have early spring blooms and then late fall blooms. I've seen this one blooming into mid-December with the right amount of sun. The monarch butterflies, when they're migrating through and they're hungry and they need a fast food stop, this is a great one. Super beautiful white blooms. This one is pretty deer sensitive. Sometimes more moderate, but I consider it more sensitive, especially out in the hill country. If you look at where it's growing in the wild, it's growing on those steep roads. What's the one that's out by Vanderpool? That's a steep, winding mountain road. You'll see it growing along the side of the road there on the cliff, because that's where it gets the protection from the deer that it wants. That is a relatively tall woody shrub. The Greg's mist flower, which is more short and low-lying, is more herbaceous. It doesn't have the woody components, but the white mist flower is a good one for having, something more structural. I talked about scarlet sage a little bit earlier when I was talking about cardinal flower. This is one that we use in our gardens all the time because, like I said, it's a great moisture indicator. It's highly deer resistant because of that sagey flavor, and it's one of the longest blooming plants that I've seen in central Texas. It has been blooming for me on Christmas, so that's kind of nice to have those nice red blooms for very ornamental purposes around Christmas times. Some of the individuals I've seen be perennial. More commonly, it's annual, so I'd say maybe short-lived perennial is a good classification for it. Another one, reseeds readily, buy one, get 20 free. And thank you all so much for listening tonight. I hope y'all learned a little bit about what plants you can use in a rainbow. And one last thing before I get off the stage. What was that thing I wanted y'all to remember? Go ahead. Sink the water in. All right, one more time. Slow the water down, spread the water out, sink the water in. Thank y'all so much. Have a good night.